Hello, friends. We are talking today about Esther, and we're reading through the Bible in a year. We are in Esther. Yesterday's reading, today's reading, and that's it. We're on to Job tomorrow. Job's a much longer book than Esther. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are all shortish books, and we've worked through them relatively quickly in comparison to some of the others. I just want to spend a few minutes with you today talking about Esther. Esther is one story. But why is it so important? That's kind of what I want to talk about as we've been looking at the big picture things that are going on throughout the biblical story. Why does Esther matter in that big picture story? Esther is an interesting book because it's one of two that don't mention God specifically in the book, and yet it's very significant to the big picture story of God's people that we've been telling all the way through. So context, right? Where in the story? And that's one of the things that I want to challenge you to do, to always think about whether you're just reading the portion of a Bible, maybe for a devotional or daily reading, whether you're preparing to teach a Bible study or preach a sermon, to think about where is this at, this text of scripture, in the big picture of the story. So the book of Esther takes place in exile. Remember, we were talking about that time at the end of the books of Second Kings and Second Chronicles, up until and in exile, where because of their continual sin and rebellion against God, he allowed other nations to come in to conquer their people. Jerusalem was destroyed, and the surviving people were taken off into exile. The northern kingdom happened earlier with Assyria, the southern kingdom from Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. Some different kings are kind of transpiring here. So the story of Esther takes place in exile. They're not in Israel. They're not in Judah. They're not around Jerusalem. They're in another place. They're a minority population in this Persian territory. And that's where the story of Esther takes place. And what's ultimately at stake in the book of Esther is the survival of the Jewish people. And the give and take and ins and outs of this particular story. There's several main characters: the king, there's a bad guy named Haman, there's a good guy of sorts in the story named Mordecai, and of course Esther, who's his cousin that he has responsibility for, younger, kind of second generation. This is kind of one story, right, that goes through, and again, what's at risk is the stake of the people. It's such a wonderful story in and of itself. There's so much irony and kind of dramatic overturns that happen here in this story. As Esther finds herself in a place, she kind of wins a beauty contest of sorts to become he captures the king's attention. She does, through her beauty, and so she's in this place in the royal palace as his queen, and that's what enables her to kind of save the day of sorts in this story, right? Where this the bad dude, Haman, one of the king's top advisors, he's upset because Mordecai, as a Jewish guy, won't kind of pay homage and respect to him. So he kind of has it out to get him, and he wants to not just get him, but all the Jewish people. And so there's this major thing that's going on where all the Jewish people, young and old, are at risk of being annihilated. Of course, Esther is in this position where she is now in the palace. And so one of the most well-known, by the way, well, you really need to read the whole thing. Read this whole story. It's a good story. It will keep you going. It's not boring. It's very, very interesting. But it's in chapter 4 that probably the most well-known passage of the story, rightfully so, comes in chapter 4. And it really relates to both, and how we tend to see it sometimes is as a kind of an individual thing with what a difference one person can make. Again, rightfully so. But it's more than just the story of one person's faith. It is that, but it's the story of this kind of big picture of God at work without being specifically mentioned, sort of right in the preservation of his people. So they're right in the midst of this, in the kind of height of the conflict here and the potential problem, where Mordecai is basically saying to Esther, you've got a chance to make a difference here, potentially. Look what he says. This is chapter 4, verse 12. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, so basically the king doesn't know she's Jewish at this point, right? She's part of that, part of the people there. So the conflict for her, just kind of real quick, right, is do I speak up and maybe have the king be angry with me, or do I be quiet, potentially save my own life and allow my people to be killed, right? So Mordecai says, do not think that because you're in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, if you don't do anything, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. So Mordecai has confidence, I think we could say maybe in God's provision, that God will be at work because of the covenants, perhaps, because of God's character, because of God's promises. Mordecai expresses that faith, at least in that way. But you and your father's family will perish. Right? So he says, I have faith that God's going to keep his promises alive, but you and me and us, we may not make it. And this is the most famous line probably from the book of Esther. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. For such a time as this is probably the most famous phrase in the book of Esther, right? And again, kind of this questioning or wondering or exploration of how God is at work, bringing us to places and working through us and working in spite of us and behind the scenes and whatever. Who knows? But that it's something for us to think about, to consider in our own lives and the places that we find ourselves, and how God may be at work in ways that we can't see to put us in places to make a significant difference. So Esther responds to his challenge, and she says, I'll do it. I'll go to the king. If I perish, I perish. So she kind of has bravery in that sense. So of course, in the grand scheme of the story, there's a lot of, it's a great story. You have to read it. The one who wants to have the Jews killed, himself and his family are killed as a result. He kind of catches himself in his own trap, so to speak. And as a result of this, there's instituted one of the festivals called Purim, and on that holiday, the end of chapter 9 recounts us how this became a regular remembrance, and one of the major traditions that would happen during this feast festival is that the book of Esther would be read, and you could imagine hearing the story read and how exciting it would be. It's a victorious story. It's also interesting to think about it being read in the midst of being under, because it was the case for the next, generations until AD 70, when the temple is destroyed even again. But as they come back, they're under the government of other other rulers. They're not self-governed as God's people, as Jewish people. They're always under somebody else for a lot of time, right under Rome. We know as we go into the New Testament time frame. So it's interesting to think about sort of that context. But it's a story that continues to be remembered of bravery, but of God's provision for His people in the midst of difficult circumstances. One of the things to kind of wrestle with here that I hadn't really thought about before in looking at Esther is the kind of violence that's kind of enabled by these people towards those who are oppressing them, and how that may shape the imaginations of people going forward as it relates to this kind of impulse towards picking up the sword to fight against the folks, and kind of how that might work into their imaginations. So Esther, great book. What are your thoughts? What did you see in Esther? What did you like in Esther? What are you thinking about or troubled by? Whatever. Please feel free to leave your thoughts, comments. Quick video here, 11 minutes today. So there you go. I'll catch you later. Bye.